Welcome. Just to remind you, don't look at that handout. Take it home. Look at it later, but don't look at it now. I'm here to talk about Alzheimer's disease. And we have a very mixed group here from what I understand. We have some people who are professionals in the field, some people who run assisted living programs, some people who are family members of residents at some assisted living programs, some people who have family members who have had Alzheimer's or may have it now. And so what I'm going to try to do tonight is to hopefully answer all of your questions. That's an impossible task, but I'm going to try. I'm going to really try to get to some of the real important issues when it comes to Alzheimer's disease, try to get rid of some of the myths that people have, try to get us all on the same page so you can all be good consumers of medicine, of residential types of facilities, of adult daycare facilities, but most importantly, to be a good member of our society these days, because as you'll be hearing, we're really facing an epidemic. You're going to be hearing that around 1 out of 3 people age 85 and older has this disease, the dementia from the disease. We need to all be good consumers and good members of society and really understand about Alzheimer's disease. So in order to do that, I'm going to try to give you a lot of information tonight. I might not even get to all of it. I'm going to try to, but I might not, depending on how many questions you all have. I don't want this to be me just rattling off things. I have lots of funny things I'm going to say, I hope. I have lots of interesting things, I hope. But unless I answer your questions and get to the stuff that you want to really know, then I've failed at my job. All right, so through tonight, I want you to interrupt if you have a question. I'll warn you that 90% of the time, I'll tell you, wait a second, because the next slide's going to answer it. Because I've done these types of talks so often, I know what the questions are, and I've usually put in the answer right after it comes up. So I may tell you, wait a little bit. Or if there's a question about a specific family member or loved one or a client at someplace, and you want to talk to me after the formal lecture part, be glad to talk to you individually. So if you do have a question, I'll repeat the questions to make sure that those folks in their living rooms get to hear it as well. So I want to just start by telling you something that happened recently. I had a couple gentlemen in my waiting room. They came to have an evaluation by me. And one was saying to the other, I just went to this fantastic restaurant with my wife. The food and service was great. The guy next to him really didn't want to have anything to do with him. Just wanted to sit and get to his appointment. But he said, oh, really? Well, what was the name of the place? And the first guy said, oh, geez, I was afraid you were going to say that. I don't remember. That's why I'm here to see Dr. Stern. But he said, wait. What do you call that long-stemmed flower that people give on special occasions? And the first guy said, you mean a rose? And the other one said, yeah, that's it. And he turned to his wife and he said, Rose, what's the name of the place we went to the other day? So those of you in your living rooms, that was explosive laughter, thinking that was incredibly funny. I start off with a joke in order to make sure you're aware that one very important thing must take place. Must take place if you're dealing with Alzheimer's disease, and that is humor. You have to have a sense of humor. And please know that it's okay to have a sense of humor. If your loved one puts the deodorant in the refrigerator, fine. If they put their bra on top of their winter coat, that's fine. These things happen. Laugh at it. Laugh with it. Make sure you maintain a sense of humor. So tonight, I'm going to hopefully keep a sense of humor, hopefully let you remember to laugh every so often. But there's a couple other things that are really necessary when you are dealing with Alzheimer's disease. They too also start with H. So 2 other words that begin with H that are so important when dealing with Alzheimer's disease. Anyone else have one? Help? Yep. Any others? Okay, hope and help. There they are. It works 100% of the time. However, I do get additional ones sometime after these first two very important ones come out, like humility, hugs, all important. But these two are so huge. We need hope. Without hope, there's no reason to get up in the morning. We need to have hope, not just that there's going to be some great treatment, but that you can connect with your loved one. Hope that the next generation won't have to deal with this the way we are now. And we all need help, whether you are a patient with Alzheimer's disease, whether you're a loved one, whether you are a professional in the field, whatever it is, you need some help. You can't go through this alone. All right, we're going to start with a test. This is a true-false question. Look at the slide. For those of you who can't see it well, it's an old Superman, wrinkles and all, about to jump out of the window with his cape, and he says, "Dang, now where was I going?" And on the bottom it says, "Superman in his later years." So the true-false is, this is Superman in his later years, meaning there's just part of normal aging. It's what happens to even someone like Superman. How many people think that's true? How many people think it's false, that there's something wrong? How many people are afraid to raise their hands? It's false. In fact, it's a myth. It's a myth that if you live long enough, you're going to get Alzheimer's disease or dementia or something else that's going to have an impact on healthy cognitive functioning. The fact is that Alzheimer's disease and other causes of dementia are not an inevitable part of aging. Yes, almost everyone does have a little bit of mild forgetfulness as we get older. We get a little creakier, we get a little slower, same thing with our memory, but we don't forget things. It just may be harder to pull out. And not everyone develops a brain disease such as Alzheimer's. That's what Alzheimer's is a brain disease that significantly impacts things like memory, judgment, personality, behavior. Millions and millions of Americans reach very old age with intact memory and very, very little problem with their thinking. Real important to know. And so, one of the take-home messages for tonight is significant cognitive decline is not part of normal aging. And when there is significant decline, there is something wrong. What do we call that something wrong? What's the term we use to describe that something's gone wrong with our ability to think and remember? Dementia. Yeah, dementia. That something is called dementia. We used to call it being senile, right? Senility. It's an old-fashioned term. It doesn't usually work in my mind because really what senile means is old. The original Latin meaning for senile is old. And actually the English translation or meaning for definition of senile is old, which just makes us think that getting old makes it so you lose your cognitive functioning, and it's not true. So we use a different term these days, dementia. What is it? It is merely this. It refers to the loss of memory and some other cognitive functions that result in a significant problem in social and occupational functioning. In other words, you have some memory difficulties, some other cognitive problems, and it gets in the way of daily life. It has to be bad enough to get in the way of daily life. That is what dementia means. It's not an illness. It's not a disease. It's kind of like having a fever. If you have a fever, what does it tell you? You're sick. It doesn't tell you anything more than that. It just means you're sick. There's something wrong. And so it's important to then find out what's wrong so you can hopefully do something about it. Dementia just means there's something wrong with your brain. It doesn't tell you what's wrong. There are some things that are reversible that can result in dementia. Things like hypothyroidism, things like vitamin B12 deficiency, things like clinical depression, which is a brain disorder that can result in cognitive impairment. But what we're really here tonight to talk about are the neurodegenerative diseases, these brain diseases that are progressive in nature, that slowly eat away at the brain. Things like vascular dementia, used to be referred to as multi-infarct dementia. Things like frontotemporal dementia, also referred to as frontotemporal lobar degeneration. Lewy body disease, or dementia with Lewy body. Chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE, the disease that affects athletes when they hit their heads over and over again. But what we're here to talk about tonight is chronic traumatic, no, I'm used to talking about chronic traumatic encephalopathy. Cut that out of the TV thing. Stern didn't say that. Is Alzheimer's disease. Why are we talking about Alzheimer's disease? Because it accounts for around 75 to 80% of all cases of dementia. All right? So, dementia is a clinical syndrome. It's not a disease. Alzheimer's is a disease, a brain disease, that eventually causes dementia, where dementia is the end product of the disease. And so it's not like you get first a little bit of dementia, and if it gets bad enough, it's Alzheimer's disease. It doesn't work that way. Alzheimer's disease is the disease that's there for a long time. We'll discuss that in a few minutes. And it's only when it gets so bad that it destroys so much brain tissue that it gets in the way of memory functioning, other cognitive functioning, and it gets even worse and it gets in the way of daily life. That's when we would just refer to it as dementia. Questions? If you get that and you remember it, you'll be better than almost every primary care physician out there that you'll see. So why are we even talking about this topic in the first place? Well, because it is unbelievably common. Every 68 seconds, someone in just this country alone develops the dementia from Alzheimer's disease. There's around 5.2 million Americans currently with dementia from Alzheimer's, and that number is going to grow and grow and grow. So it's going to be around 7 million by 2025, and around 14 million by 2050. Why is it getting so high? Baby boomers, you guessed it. Us baby boomers are turning age 60 at a rate of 330 an hour. And age happens to be the biggest risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. That doesn't mean age causes Alzheimer's, but it's one of these diseases that we see more as we get older. Think about so many diseases: cancer, heart disease, strokes, arthritis, diabetes. All of these things that we see now as we get older more and more. Why is that? Well, because we as human beings weren't meant to live past the age of 40. But now, because of the wonders of modern medicine and industrialization, we live longer. And as we live longer, we're seeing more and more those diseases and illnesses and conditions that we would never have seen before because we would have died before they would have reared their ugly head. Alzheimer's disease is one of them. It's a disease that is more common as we get older, but it's not that age causes it. Does that make sense? All right. 1 in 9 individuals over the age of 65 has Alzheimer's dementia. 1 in 3 over the age of 85. That's a lot. It's the 6th leading cause of death in this country. 6th leading cause of death amongst everyone. It's the 5th leading cause of death amongst people 65 and older. And it's the only cause of death in the top 10 causes of death that cannot be prevented, can't be cured, and can't even be slowed down right now. Think about this. In this graph, if you can see it, this is showing the changes in mortality rates, in death rates in this country between the years 2000 and 2008. And what you can see is for all of the other diseases listed here, stroke, prostate cancer, breast cancer, heart disease, HIV/AIDS, there was a decline in mortality rates during that time period. Alzheimer's disease, a 66% increase in death. And yet, the research dollars that are going to Alzheimer's disease are a pittance compared to any of these others. Teeny, teeny fraction. I did just talk about Alzheimer's disease having death rates, and that it's the 6th leading cause of death. And a lot of you are saying, well, I didn't think people died from Alzheimer's disease. Well, they do. It is a fatal disease. At least 500,000 deaths per year in this country alone caused by Alzheimer's disease. It's probably a whole lot more, but what happens is Alzheimer's disease is not listed in the death certificate for the cause of death. What's the most common thing listed in a death certificate? Heart failure. Well, duh. I mean, if the heart didn't fail, there wouldn't be death, right? So sometimes it gets down to like dementia or cognitive impairment or frailty or all these things. So these numbers right now of 500,000 deaths per year are probably a huge underestimate. The average time from diagnosis to death is around 8 years. But that's highly, highly variable. Some people can last 20 years or more from diagnosis to death. Other people, it can be very short. Why that variability? Any idea? Age. You said both of them. Depends on how advanced the disease is when someone was diagnosed. If, there's no magic time when you go to the doctor and all of a sudden, poof, oh, now starting today you have Alzheimer's disease. It's all based on when or if you ever get diagnosed. And when you get diagnosed, it could be at the very early stages of the clinical problems, or it can be really late in the disease course. So it just depends when you get diagnosed, what the delay is between diagnosis and passing away. Also, the age at diagnosis, because if you don't get diagnosed until you're 87, you might be dying sooner. The most common causes of death in Alzheimer's disease are infections, especially pneumonia. In the later stages of the disease, someone has a hard time swallowing, and so they might breathe in their saliva or their food. If that's the case, then they get pneumonia. And because they're not walking near the end and they can't cough easily, then it sits there and it turns into a bacterial infection and the person can't get healed. Urinary tract infections are also very common, especially in women, that can eventually just destroy the rest of the body. But someone can, in fact, just die from the body being unable to be kept alive because the brain is so devastated. The brain controls everything. And if the brain is so hurt that the person may just pass quietly. Let's talk about the impact of Alzheimer's disease on the individual. This is my favorite way of describing the impact of Alzheimer's on the individual. For those of you who can't see it, it's two dinosaurs on an island and Noah's Ark is taking off and it says, oh crap, was that today? But seriously, this is a self-portrait of an amazing artist, a portrait artist named William Utemohlen. Utemohlen actually has some local roots. He was the artist in residence at Williams College in Williamstown for several years. But he was an internationally known portrait artist. I know that he was so well known because one day I was giving a talk something like this in Manhattan as a fundraiser. And there were a lot of very wealthy people in the audience, and I show this picture, and someone screams, "Oh, William! He did my portrait in Paris!" I was so excited. But look at this. That's an amazing, amazing self-portrait. Unfortunately, around 30 years later, Ute Molen was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, and by then it had already really hurt his brain a lot. He was completely amnestic, meaning he couldn't remember anything, couldn't make new memories. However, he was still able to draw. Look at that. Here's someone who couldn't remember from moment to moment, and yet this is his self-portrait. But at that point, the disease started really getting bad. And 1 year later, this was as good as he could do. 1 year later. 1 year later. And just a few years later from the beginning. He passed away soon thereafter. And I'm showing you this because many people think of Alzheimer's disease as purely a memory problem. And it's not. It's a brain disease. It eventually destroys the entire brain. So what are the symptoms? What does it look like? Well, yes, memory loss that disrupts daily life is the most important new first symptom in most people. Most, not all, but most people start with having some kind of memory problem. And the memory problem is such that it is not a problem remembering things from the past. Okay? You remember things from, you can remember who was at your wedding, who was in the army with you, who was your first grade teacher, who were your classmates, how do you play the violin, all those things are there. It's really hard to forget those things. The problem with Alzheimer's memory is that you can't store new things. The part of the brain that's responsible for storing new information is called the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is this little structure in the very deep middle parts of the brain. And that gets hurt early in the disease course. And when it's hurt, the brain does not have the ability to make new memories. Yes?
There must be some foods that will nourish the brain.
So the question is, there must be some foods that will nourish the brain. I'm going to talk about things like that later on. So yes, you beat me to it. I'm going to get to some food things later on. Thank you. So you have this memory problem, and it is eventually quite profound, with the inability to remember what just happened 10 minutes ago. And yet you have the person who can remember all the details from 50 years ago, and so then you have the person who's saying the same story over and over and over again, because they don't remember that they said the story. They're telling you something that they remember, but they can't remember that they just told you. And no matter how hard they try, they can't bring up that new information. If you told them something yesterday, it's not there. And if you say, "Oh, come on, dear, remember?" No, they don't remember. No matter how hard you want them to try, they can't. But it's not just memory. There can also be problems with planning or solving problems around the house, at work, in life. There can be difficulty completing tasks at home, or perhaps if the person's still working, or hobbies. There can be some confusion with time or place. There can be some difficulty understanding visual things and spatial relationships, like in driving, the ability to judge the distance between you and the car coming to you, or angles. There can also be problems with coming up with words when speaking or writing. That tip of the tongue phenomenon that we all have, it can get in the way of just communication in the person with Alzheimer's disease.
Now, does that happen when the disease progresses,
Now, yep, so good question. So the word finding problems, the question is, does it happen just at the later stages or can it happen early on? And those word finding problems can actually happen early on. In some people, it can be the first problem. In other people, it can be much later. But it's not a late problem.
But if the person is not aware of it,
And I'm going to talk about that.
close by who happen to be there, 'cause sometimes you're alone, you're by yourself.
Yeah,
And if these moments happen, no one is aware of it really,
Yeah.
unless they see signs.
That's
that they
right.
may never see.
So it's, I'm going to get,
The reason why
yeah.
I say that, because I have Alzheimer's, the early stage.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm saying.
Thank you for bringing that up. As your experience is that when you're alone and you have these things go on, if no one's around, how does anyone know? Because you might not remember that it happened, or you might not be aware when it's happening. And that's a real problem. It's a real difficulty.
Well, in my case, I did go to a specialist.
Mm-hmm.
And this is when I was first diagnosed with the early stages. So that prepared me.
That's wonderful. Thank you. I appreciate you sharing that. And you hit on some very important things that I'm about to get to. This does not mean problems coming up with people's names. So a lot of you who might not have Alzheimer's are probably saying, thank goodness, because I can't come up with people's names. I just never could remember people's names. I'm always going to, I can't even remember my wife's name sometime, or people who work for me. Thank goodness what we know about that is that it's part of normal aging. It's one of those few things that does go wrong as part of normal brain aging, coming up with familiar names. But coming up with words is not a memory problem, and it's not a familiar name problem. It's a language problem, and it's an important aspect of Alzheimer's disease. Another possible symptom is misplacing things, having the inability to retrace one's steps, decreased or poor judgment, making poor decisions, not figuring out that there's ramifications to your actions. Very often withdrawal from social or work activities. Not just because one is embarrassed, but because there is a withdrawal. There's a lack of interest, a lack of concern, a lack of energy. And there can be changes in mood and personality, including things like apathy, that lack of motivation, that lack of interest, as well as depression, because changes in the brain can bring on the same type of depression that we might see in others. And then something that was brought up is a change in awareness, the inability to be aware that you have a problem. And this is really interesting because it's an actual neurologic condition. It has a fancy name called anosognosia. And anosognosia means the neurologically based inability to be aware that you have a neurologic problem. What a concept. The neurologically based inability to be aware that you have a neurologic problem. You combine that with not remembering that you were told that you have a neurologic problem. And it can be okay sometimes for the individual with the disease, but it can be very frustrating for those around the person. The Alzheimer's Association has a whole lot of really great things on its website. If you haven't been to the website or gone to one of the chapter offices, I highly recommend you go to the Alzheimer's Association. And one of the things you can get are these 10 warning signs for Alzheimer's disease, many of which I just listed here. I'm often asked, like the question earlier about, is the language thing part of the beginning phase or the later phase? Does everyone have a memory problem at the beginning? You know, if my loved one is here today, what should I expect in a year? And the problem is, we just don't know. And in the field, we have a saying, if you've seen one Alzheimer's patient, you've seen one Alzheimer's patient. Everyone is highly individual. All right. Another reason to talk about this thing is because of its impact on the economy. Some of you probably have been hearing just a little bit that we've had a problem with our economy. You know, I keep hearing about these cliffs that we're about to go over. Believe it or not, Alzheimer's disease is one of the biggest single factors for our economy being the way it is. The national cost of caring for people with Alzheimer's dementia is about $200 billion every year. That's around 25% of the stimulus bill. Remember that famous stimulus bill? A quarter of that entire bill is the national cost for taking care of people with Alzheimer's dementia. And it's expected to rise to $1.1 trillion by 2050. This year alone, 2014, Medicare and Medicaid are expected to pay $150 billion in the healthcare, long-term care, and hospice for people with Alzheimer's disease and other causes of dementia. $150 billion. That is a quarter of every Medicare dollar. A quarter of every Medicare dollar spent is for the beneficiaries with Alzheimer's disease, and not just all of their health care, but only those things directly related to the Alzheimer's dementia. The average cost for a memory care assisted living facility is around $60,000 a year. Costs to businesses, large and small, for the caregivers, the people who are employed but who are also caregivers of people with dementia. It's huge. It's around $37 billion a year. Why? Because caregivers have to take time off. They have to take time off to take care of their loved ones, to bring them to doctor's appointments, to make sure that they're safe. Or they themselves become ill from stress-related disorders, from the incredible burdens and stressors of taking care of someone with dementia. Caregivers can be spouses, partners. They can be members of the sandwich generation, adult children, taking care of their parent, but also having their own kids. Grandchildren can be caregivers. They can be members of faith communities, friends, neighbors, you name it. And these caregivers, there's around 15 million of them. 15 million of them. Billions and billions of hours a year of free care being provided by family caregivers. And the caregivers, again, don't just suffer emotionally, they also suffer physically. And perhaps one of the biggest problems that caregivers face, whatever their relationship, an adult child or spouse, is lost dreams. You plan for the future, you plan for retirement, or you plan for your parent being able to take care of the grandkids. And those dreams go away. The person's still there. And it's important to remember that the person with Alzheimer's dementia is not dead. And both the patient and the caregiver can benefit tremendously from maintaining emotional closeness, from maintaining physical closeness. I forgot I was going to show this. There is a microphone over here. I'm going to see if this works. Okay. And if it comes this far, all right. So here's something from Good Morning America.
What would you do? He says that he should be allowed to see other people because his wife, as he knows her, is gone.
That was the question for Pat Robertson from a viewer whose friend's
Can you hear it?
wife has Alzheimer's.
I know it sounds cruel, but if he's going to do something, he should divorce her and start all over again.
But what about this?
If you respect that vow, but you say death do us part, this is the kind of death.
With all due respect to Pat Robertson, I find that statement absurd, naive, and inhumane.
Researchers...
Yes, that's me. That's why I had to do all the shenanigans to get them. I had always wanted to say that to Pat Robertson, and I had that reason to one day. In fact, the brain may be hurt, but the person ain't dead. The heart is really still there. I want to show you Rita and Saul. Rita was a person with Alzheimer's dementia who was in a nursing home in Needham. Saul, her beloved husband, for many, many decades, he adored her and would come to the nursing home every single day, even though she wasn't looking like this at the time. She was one of these bad patients. She was grumpy, angry, wouldn't speak to anyone. They thought she couldn't speak. Was just lying there, wouldn't get up, wouldn't participate in anything, just one of these. He would still come, sit next to her, hold her hand. Then one day he had this great idea. He asked the nursing staff if it would be okay for him to lie in bed with his wife. And as he said it, to make love to her, to say how much he loved her, to stroke her, to kiss her. Well, the nursing staff had to do all of these meetings and fancy discussions and change their rules to allow poor Saul to just lie next to his wife. They rearranged the room, they changed the bed, and he was able to do this. Well, guess what? Soon after he started doing this, she got better. She started talking. She got out of bed. She wasn't grumpy and argumentative anymore. She started speaking. Now, did that change her disease? No, not at all. But it changed the way she connected. Changed the way she connected. And not only did it help her quality of life, it helped Saul's quality of life tremendously too. But he didn't stop there. Saul felt like, okay, now she's up. Let's think about what other things I can do to make her more spirited, more kind of just interacting. And he remembered that she used to love old Dean Martin songs. So he brought in a record player. Dion, do you know what a record player is? Yes. Okay. I'll introduce Dion in a few minutes.
They're coming back. Vinyl is the new whatever.
That's right. Brought in a record player and put on old Dean Martin songs. You know, when the moon hits you, I like the big pizza. And she started singing along and would then walk through the halls. This person who used to not walk, not get up, not talk, was singing her way through the halls. It's beautiful. Music does wonders. It does. It really does. You can attest to that.
I do see
Yeah.
when they have the men, the people that don't speak
Yeah.
in memory care, when there's the music, they're alive.
Isn't that?
They know every word.
So for everyone to hear this, our wonderful guest who has told us that she has Alzheimer's disease in her memory care residence, the guys who don't speak, who don't say a word all day, when the musicians come and bring music to their lives, they start singing along. We see it all the time. It's great. All right, so I brought up Dion. I have to introduce Dion. You'll all hopefully get to spend a lot of time with Dion after I'm through talking and talking. Dion Esses is one of our wonderful research assistants at the BU Alzheimer's Disease Center. Dion is here to answer questions about participating in research when I'm done, to give you more information, and to just smile because she has such a great smile. But when I'm done, I'll be pointing you in her direction at the end. All right, so enough of this gushy stuff, okay? No more music and lovey-dovey stuff. Let's talk science. Alzheimer's disease is indeed a neurodegenerative disease, okay? It's a progressive brain disease. And it's marked by these two things that we refer to as plaques and tangles. Plaques and tangles. We've known about these things for 100 years, more than 100 years at this point. It was around 1905 when Dr. Alzheimer had the first patient that was considered to have this disease. The first one described. It was this woman named Auguste D. And she was this individual who had no memory, just awful progressive memory difficulty. And she also had personality changes, and they thought that she was paranoid. They thought that she was making it up that her husband was having an affair with her next-door neighbor. Well, then she died from this disease. You should know that the husband then got married to the next-door neighbor. So much for paranoia. And Dr. Alzheimer was not only her clinician, he then became the neuropathologist. He looked at her brain tissue after she passed away, with putting some special stains on these thin slices of brain tissue and looking at it under a microscope. And what did he say? What did he see? But these things that he referred to as plaques and tangles. And the plaques we now sometimes refer to as senile plaques or amyloid plaques, mostly called amyloid plaques or neuritic plaques, all these different words, are made up of a protein called beta amyloid. And this beta amyloid clumps together around the nerve cells. And by plaques, I'm not referring to the same kind of cholesterol-based plaques that we get inside our blood vessels. These are just these proteins, these tiny molecular-sized things surrounding the nerve cells that then have an effect on the functioning of the nerve cells and has this toxic effect on the overall brain. And what we know now is that these plaques then seem to turn on the production of an abnormal form of another protein called tau. And this tau protein clumps together inside the nerve cells and tangles together and creates these things called neurofibrillary tangles. And so you have plaques outside the nerve cells, you have tangles inside the nerve cells. The tangles become toxic, they destroy how the neurons, the nerve cells communicate from one to another, and eventually destroy the nerve cells. And more brain cells die, more and more tissue gets destroyed. Just to give you an idea, on the left is a kind of a cartoon of what it would look like under a microscope, where the big things are the neurons, the nerve cells, and around it is the other part of the brain, the rest of the tissue. And on the left is a normal, healthy person, but on the right is the brain of someone with Alzheimer's disease, and you can see the buildup of the amyloid plaques around the nerve cells and inside those tangles inside the neurons. As the disease progresses and more brain cells get destroyed and more tissue gets hurt, what happens is the brain atrophies, it shrinks. So what you see here are two halves of brain, one on the left from someone with a healthy, intact brain, and the other on the right is the person with Alzheimer's disease. And it's if you kind of cut the head like this and looked at it that way. And you can see the atrophy in the person with Alzheimer's. All right, so Alzheimer's disease doesn't just come out of the blue. These plaques and tangles don't just appear overnight and poof, you have this disease. In fact, it's likely that the plaques and tangles begin to accumulate many years before the first symptom ever starts. A recent study found that the amyloid buildup, those plaques, can begin around 25 years before the first symptoms. So what that results in is this kind of staging of Alzheimer's disease, where the first stage we refer to as preclinical, meaning there's no symptoms, but those brain changes have already begun. The next we refer to as mild cognitive impairment, or MCI. And this is the term used when the very first symptoms begin, when the person or their friends or family start complaining that there's a memory problem or other cognitive problem, but it's not bad enough to get in the way of daily life. It's real, so if you test the person with formal memory tests or other cognitive tests, they don't do well. But it's not bad enough to get in the way of daily life, and if it's not bad enough to get in the way of daily life, we can't call it dementia. And then the third stage is dementia from Alzheimer's disease. And that's when the memory problems, the other cognitive difficulties get worse and worse, and the person cannot function independently or as well as they used to. And that's the dementia from Alzheimer's disease. Yes, ma'am?
Can I ask a question? I know the dementia with the mind. Now, does it affect your body?
Yeah, very good
Much
question.
by walking and
Yeah.
balance?
So that's a great question. So Alzheimer's disease only affects the mind, the brain, which is the mind. But the brain controls the rest of our body. And so Alzheimer's disease can have an effect on movement and on kind of general well-being. But the major part of what happens, especially early on, are the thinking, the memory, the mood, the behavior, the personality, those types of things. Great questions. So how do we even diagnose it? Well, I show this picture of a finger stick, a blood prick, because it reminds me that when I first started talking about Alzheimer's disease, I would say, there ain't no way we're ever going to have a blood test for Alzheimer's disease. And so I'd show this picture. No way, we're never going to have a blood test for Alzheimer's disease. Now I show it because we're really getting close. I'm blown away. We're actually getting close to having a blood test to diagnose Alzheimer's disease. But we're not there yet. And so right now in 2014, if you go to the doctor, the best way to diagnose Alzheimer's is through a clinical diagnosis, meaning right now without actually looking at the brain tissue and seeing those plaques and tangles under a microscope, we can't completely accurately diagnose Alzheimer's disease, even in 2014. And so the best diagnosis right now, if you go to the doctor or you see a specialist, is a clinical diagnosis based on a good history, a clinical examination, imaging of the brain, and some formal memory testing and other cognitive testing. This is the best part of it. This is the most important part of it, is getting a good history, not just from the person with the problem. Because remember, the person with the problem might not be aware that they have a problem, and they might not remember to tell you what they know. So making sure that someone else who really knows the individual is there to give some history. But the good clinician who knows something about this disease should be able to get a really good history, perhaps get a scan to rule out other things. And if they have some confusion, to get some formal testing to see what the profile of strengths and weaknesses are. And they should be able to make the diagnosis. Yes? What kind of doctor is the question? So there's this continuum. There are really great primary care doctors who really know Alzheimer's disease. And they themselves can handle it all. That's rare. Then you have specialists, a neurologist, who you think might be the person to go to. And there are some neurologists, especially special types called behavioral neurologists, someone who's a dementia specialist, who probably can Do it all. Then you have some other neurologist, a general neurologist, who isn't that used to this stuff, and they can be dreadful. If you are to see a specialist, someone called a behavioral neurologist would be terrific. A neuropsychologist who specializes in dementia and Alzheimer's would be helpful. A neuropsychiatrist, if there's a lot of behavioral difficulties initially, that person might be able to do it. A geriatrician, who's a primary care physician for seniors, might be able to. I can tell you, though, I train the geriatricians at Boston University when they're going through their training. I teach them all about Alzheimer's disease. And I'm shocked that by the time they get to me, they know nothing. And if I didn't do what I do during my 5 or 6 sessions with them, they'd probably come out not knowing a lot. So it's really it's varied. This is what you have to avoid when you go to the doctor, no matter what. Because these are things that all types of doctors say all too often. First one, don't worry, it's just a little bit of dementia. Well, you all now know that saying a little bit of dementia is basically the same thing as a little bit pregnant. There is no such thing. It's not like a little bit of dementia, and then it's going to get bad and bad and bad and bad and bad, and then you have Alzheimer's disease. It's not like that. Alzheimer's disease starts way before the dementia. It's just that it's hard to say for sure that the person has Alzheimer's disease as the cause of their dementia. So if someone's saying it's dementia, it's important to ask, do you think it's caused by Alzheimer's disease? And if they say, oh, no, it's not that bad, then go someplace else because they don't know what they're talking about. Another one, yes?
So what are the other causes?
So they're the things that I briefly said at the beginning that I can't really go into that much detail. The important ones that a doctor needs to deal with are the reversible causes of dementia. Things like the vitamin deficiencies, the thyroid changes, the depression, things like that. But other diseases, other than Alzheimer's disease, there's many of them. But Alzheimer's is the most common cause of dementia. Another thing that you shouldn't hear, but that is heard all too often, is, I'm sorry, but it's Alzheimer's disease. Have them take this Aricept, call me in a few weeks, see if we should increase it, and you should probably get his affairs in order. Well, that stinks. That takes away all hope. It takes away all compassion, all understanding that the person's there. And often, this type of thing is done without doing the extra steps, without figuring out what might be reversible, or without really knowing that it's Alzheimer's disease. And then the final one is so common. Oh, it's just normal aging. Usually said by an older clinician. But it's hard to do if you don't do this all the time. It is hard to do. So in this one, you have the doctor sitting there and the very stereotyped nurse saying, well, if you're stumped, why not write an illegible prescription and hope the pharmacist comes up with something? Well, you know, it's funny, but it's also a little true out there. And so, fortunately, where we are now in 2014 is we're moving away from the pure clinical diagnosis to one that includes what we refer to as biomarkers. And biomarkers are objective biological tests. Think about it. All of our other diseases. There's a test for it, right? You can have a biopsy for cancer. You can have an angiogram for heart disease. You can have insulin levels and glucose levels for diabetes. You can have MRI for arthritis. You can have every disease and condition has a test. These neurodegenerative diseases, they don't. Because the brain is so complex. It's the most complex organ we have. But it also makes us smart. And a lot of smart neuroscientists have been working on this problem for a long time now. And we're finally getting to the point where we can test for the things that we know make up Alzheimer's disease. And so what you have here on the right is a scan, a PET scan, where all of the red stuff is that amyloid inside the living human brain. Here's another one. Here's on the left what the scans would look like in a cognitively healthy person. These are real scans. And on the right, the person with Alzheimer's disease, everything that's lighting up is amyloid. This is so cool. We're looking inside the human brain and being able to detect this bad protein that is seen in Alzheimer's disease. This scan is actually available out there now. It's FDA approved. It's called Amyvid. The problem is that the FDA approved it 2 years ago. Medicare won't pay for it. I went down to Washington several months ago to the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services with a small number of colleagues basically saying, you have got to be kidding. We have this very important thing now. You need to cover it. The next step, though, would be to be able to have pictures of that other protein, tau, because amyloid is just part of the picture. And in fact, it's the tau that's related to or associated with the amount of impairment in people. And so, something that I never thought was going to happen for many, many years is that some other really smart people came up with this new way of using a PET scan to see tau in people's brains while they're alive. This is the brain of someone who's completely healthy, an older individual who's completely healthy. This is the brain of someone with mild cognitive impairment, and you can start seeing a little bit of the tau. Here's the brain of someone with Alzheimer's dementia, but not too bad, and you can start seeing it even more. And here you have someone with more advanced dementia from Alzheimer's disease, and the tau is widespread throughout the brain. This is an incredible time we're living in. There's other ways to pick up these on the diagnosis, things like using spinal taps or lumbar punctures to measure spinal fluid. An incredibly helpful way of doing this. There are other types of scans that are now used that can help with the diagnosis. And so we have this ability now to detect and diagnose Alzheimer's disease very, very early. And in fact, using these types of approaches, we can diagnose the disease before there's any symptoms. And so many of you are sitting there saying, why the heck would I want to know if there's nothing that can be done about it? Well, right now, this year, you are living right at the kind of most exciting time in the entire history of Alzheimer's disease is this year. Because we're at the point where we can break out of this catch-22. In order to move our research forward and be able to have successful interventions, successful drugs, let's say, we must be able to start those drugs earlier in the disease process before you lose too much brain tissue. Because once you lose a lot of brain tissue, you can't get it back. So in order for a treatment to be successful, you need to start it early. But then if there's nothing that can be done, why do you want to know to start something early? Well, right now, you'll be hearing at the end, we started to have real breakthroughs in this. So we have the ability to find out early before there's symptoms, and we now have several new clinical trials, research studies, that are aimed directly at early phases of the disease, preclinical and mild cognitive impairment, and the early stages of dementia, with new drugs that are aimed at slowing the progression of the disease. So, for example, preclinicals up here, mild cognitive impairment is here, dementia down here. The typical person as they go through life with this, will go through those phases. Starting up here, no symptoms, but they still have the disease. Then it gets a little worse, and they have that mild cognitive impairment. And then it gets a little worse, and they start having dementia. They have the inability to do things the way they used to. And then sadly, it progresses, and eventually someone will pass. Well, typically, with these types of diseases, we wouldn't start the intervention until someone has symptoms. Yes?
You mentioned bad protein. Do we get that in our food?
Yep, good question. The question is, the bad protein I brought up, do we get it in our food? Nope, not at all. Protein is everything. Every cell, every part of our body is made up of proteins. And so it's not like, eating chicken. Chicken is protein, but everything in our bodies are made up of proteins. So it's a different concept. So here we have the typical course of Alzheimer's disease. Yep.
How do you find out about these drugs?
I'm going to get to you and get to that for sure. That's what she's here for. So, I'm going to get through this one. I know it. If you typically go down like this, and you typically would want to start a treatment when you have symptoms, well, yeah, we could do that. But wouldn't it be better to perhaps start it there and cure it? Well, that's not going to happen. Why? Because we can't bring back the brain tissue. So, what if we started treatment after someone has some dementia, and it gives a little bit of boost, a little bit of symptomatic relief, perhaps moving the clock back 6 months or so. But it doesn't do anything to the actual course of the disease. The person still continues to go down after those 6 months. Well, in fact, that's what we currently have. The currently approved medications of Aricept, Razidine, Exelon, Namenda, all these drugs that are used for Alzheimer's disease, do that in some people, some of the time. In other words, the drugs that we currently have don't change the course of the disease. They provide a little bit of symptomatic relief for a short period of time in a small number of people. That's not a wild endorsement. It's still there, and it's still important to use if it's not causing any harm. But wouldn't it be better if once someone has symptoms, you could give something and it slows down the disease dramatically? Well, that's what these new drugs that are being used in clinical trials are supposed to do. That they alter the course of the disease so someone doesn't get worse that quickly. But ideally, wouldn't we want to prevent it in the first place? Why I was so excited about where we are now in our research is because instead of waiting for people to be symptomatic, we have these new disease-modifying drugs in clinical trials and research that are being used prior to any symptoms or earlier in the disease course. And so instead of starting them here after the person has dementia, if we start them up here or here, what happens? It eventually turns into prevention because it slows down the disease course enough that the person won't ever show the symptoms or will show very few of them. That's where we're heading right now. And if we could delay the onset of the symptoms of dementia by just 5 years, we'd cut in half the number of people with dementia. Get that? If we could just slow it down, delay it by 5 years, we'd cut in half the number of people with it. Why is that? They died of something else. That's right. That's right. But you know what? Not so bad. And so prevention and delay is critical. So let's talk about prevention. This goes to the questions of diet and things like that. The first thing to know about prevention is that we don't really know anything about prevention. There is nothing really known for sure about prevention of Alzheimer's disease. I'm going to show you the things that we know the most about, the things that we think we know. All right? The first one is that what's good for the heart is good for the brain. So sorry, get rid of those really high-fat, yucky things, high salt, high fat. That has to go. Make sure that you don't get diabetes, or if you have diabetes, you keep it in control. Sorry. What about diet in general? Well, there's research out there that suggests that blueberries and other dark berry fruit can be preventive, can be helpful for the brain in general, and in particular might slow down the progression of Alzheimer's disease. There's other research to suggest that those good fats, the omega-3 fatty acids that are found in good fish like salmon, those things might be helpful. Olives and olive oil, again, the good fats, those things might be helpful. Broccoli, there's absolutely no research that shows that broccoli is good for you, but hey, it can't hurt, right? The one finding that has been seen over and over again is the Mediterranean diet. And by the Mediterranean diet, I mean things like legumes and nuts, like lentils and chickpeas and peanuts, fruits and vegetables, olives and olive oil, those fish high in omega-3 fatty acids, and very little red meat. This type of diet has been shown now in several different studies to be somewhat preventive for Alzheimer's disease. Then comes everyone's favorite thing. What about this? Okay, let's have another vote. How many people think that drinking is preventive for Alzheimer's disease? How many people think that it's harmful? Oh, how many people aren't just afraid of raising your hands, you're just hoping that it's helpful? So the research actually shows that alcohol use in moderation, meaning 1 to 2 drinks per night for the average weight person, may decrease the risk of Alzheimer's dementia. But, yeah, I'll get to that, but only if there's no other contraindications. Okay, so if you have diabetes, if you have liver disease, things like that, you need to check with your doctor to make sure it's okay to drink. But remember, 1 to 2 drinks. A drink is a shot of hard liquor equals 1 glass of wine equals 1 beer. Okay, those are drinks. However, if you drink more than that on a regular basis, it increases your risk of getting this stuff. Sorry. And once there's cognitive impairment, then it can hurt the functioning. But that raises a really interesting question. For the person with Alzheimer's dementia, whether they're living at home or in some type of residence, is it okay to let them drink? We have a resounding yes.
No, it wasn't me.
Yeah.
They actually have a happy hour.
Yeah. You know, a lot of places now, assisted living programs, memory care programs, do allow alcohol. And you know, there's something to be said about the social part of it, but also tradition. And that if it's not causing too much problem, then a lot of people are going in that direction. So then comes, what kind of drink? Is it all alcohol? Well, there is a special thing for red wine. Some of you probably have heard about this. That red wine contains a special chemical called resveratrol. And resveratrol, if you take enough of it, seems to have a really good thing going on in the brain and may indeed help prevent Alzheimer's disease, or at least slow it down. The problem is that if you were to drink enough red wine to get enough resveratrol in you, you'd probably have to drink around 2 gallons a day. And that's not going to be helpful for you. But you can actually get resveratrol over the counter at like GNC and places like that. All right, other things. Prevention through losing weight. Yes, in fact, being fat in your 40s in research has shown that it raises your risk for getting dementia from Alzheimer's disease. And one of the most consistent findings is exercise. Regular exercise, regular aerobic exercise. Walking 20 minutes a day, getting on an exercycle or a treadmill or something like that, if you do that on a regular basis, it can dramatically decrease your risk of getting dementia from Alzheimer's disease. And in fact, there's good evidence in animal models. You have these little mice that are bred to get Alzheimer's disease, okay? And you put some of them on these little mouse treadmills, and the others you put in front of the TV, they eat popcorn, watch Oprah. And the ones that are getting the exercise actually have less of that bad amyloid protein in their brains. So what about intellectual stimulation? That's usually something that people want to bring up. Is it helpful to do intellectual activities? Well, the answer is yes and no. So, you know, things like playing cards or reading or being part of book groups or doing the crossword puzzles or Sudoku or doing computer things. Well, what seems to work best is trying new things in new ways. Don't just keep doing the same thing. If you've always been a New York Times crossword puzzle person, no need to stop it. But doing it continuously isn't going to be as helpful as trying something new. Get different connections in your brain going. Try Sudoku if you like those kinds of things. If you like languages, try learning a new language. It's never too late. Try a new route to work or to visit the kids. Try new recipes. Don't just keep doing the same thing. Read a different type of book. Start a new hobby or rekindle an old one. In fact, a recent research study showed that in people who wholly went into doing something new, were so into doing a project, they did better cognitively months later than the people who were just kind of doing the same old thing. And then comes social interactions. Some studies suggest that maintaining a strong social kind of connection may actually help prevent dementia. So instead of sitting alone, get involved with other people. If you have friendships, if you have circles of friends, keep them going. If you don't, do something to connect with other people. All right, with all of what I've said, what's really needed out there? Well, we have a growing older population. We have new drugs that are changing the course of the disease. There's going to be more and more people living with Alzheimer's disease and at the earlier stages of the disease. And so we have to not just focus on creating new drugs, but we also have to focus on things like quality of life for not just the patient, but also the caregivers. And what does that mean? Well, we need more and more support programs, more facilities. We need caregiver support. We need respite for the caregivers. We need adult daycare programs that are specific to an individual, not just one-stop shopping. You can't have a young 58-year-old healthy individual with dementia in the same program as an older, frail 88-year-old. It doesn't work. And assisted living facilities and memory support residences that are specialized in dementia and based on scientifically based programs, such as Cornerstone. That, right here in Milford. If you haven't been there, it is one of the most glorious places around. It's the way memory support stuff is supposed to be done. You walk into this place and people are interacting. They're like doing stuff. Yes? Compass is right here. I just realized that. Coming by here, this is where Golden Pond is. I've never realized. Oh, okay. All right, so Compass is on the Golden Pond. Oh my God, so that's, I knew that looked familiar. Okay, all right, so you got these two places right around here. Yeah, okay.
They also are starting their own memory care unit in Golden Pond
In addition to Compass. All right, well, this is the place to be, obviously. There's a lot more going on around here than most places, not just in Massachusetts, but in the country. And the Compass programs by senior living residences are doing it the way that should be. It's based on science. It's not just making people feel good, even though that's happened. It's an incredible staff that makes people feel good, but it's based on doing things. Music, like was discussed earlier. I always have to talk about music as an important thing. You have to leave. Tell you what, if you're interested in participating in research, which is I'm done in 5 minutes, if you can wait. If not, okay. If you want to just find out any information, have us send it to you, just stop by and let Dion know on the way out. Give her your name and phone number, and then skedaddle, if you want to do that. You can get on a mailing list or find out about anything. That's fantastic. Oh, good. Get home. Get home. All right, so the music stuff, I put this up because music does seem to help people's memory with Alzheimer's disease. And the person who did some of the initial work is actually my own son, Nicholas Simmons Stern, has done that research. So I'm a very proud person. Yes?
My mother was diagnosed when she was 82. She's now 91. And the only thing that really keeps her attention when you go to see her, her eyes light up when she recognizes people. She can't talk properly, can't move. But you start putting music on and her face lights up. And for a while she knew the words to the songs even though she could not speak.
Yeah, isn't that incredible?
The words to the songs.
And we hear that, but we hear that all the time, that someone in moderate stages of the disease might not be speaking, might not be interacting, and you put the music on, and all of a sudden they're up and about. It's fantastic. And arts in general, not just music, but the fine arts. Even not just doing it, but going to museums and looking at art is an incredible thing. There's a great documentary called I Remember Better When I Paint. You can get it on Amazon or at libraries. I think some of the Compass neighborhoods have copies of it also. But I Remember Better When I Paint. It's a really wonderful documentary, not just because I'm in it, but because it really gets the point across about how important the arts are for individuals with Alzheimer's disease. All right, so let's end with this. What's needed? Research. We have to do research to get to the next step. Yes, I'm excited in 2014 of where we are. But do you know how much sooner we could have gotten here if two things happened? If more research dollars were put into the system, and if more people participated in the clinical research, in human studies. And when it comes to participating in research, it does a lot, not just for us researchers, but it actually does a lot for the person participating by being able to play a more active role in their own health care, by gaining access to potential treatments before they're widely available, to receive expert care at leading healthcare facilities for free. And then these last three are really important. To have connections. This is a lonely disease. But by participating in research, you interact with the people who are doing the research who know this disease really well, who see it every day, and who have hope themselves. That allows you to maintain hope for yourself, for your loved one, and the hope extends to future generations because the only way we're going to be able to do something about this is by having research move along. So there's a research study for everyone. I'm not going to have you read all this. This is just to let you know that there's lists of them. In fact, you have a list, a 2-page sheet that was passed out to you. These are all of the actively recruiting studies just at BU Alzheimer's Disease Center. This is just at our program. Amazing. So take this home and look at it. But you'll see that there's studies for caregivers. There's studies for people who just want to find out to help us learn to diagnose it more. There's clinical trials for all stages of the disorder. And when it comes to research, there's usually a whole lot of questions, like, do I have to come to Boston? There's 2 Compass programs right here. Why do I have to go to Boston? Well, yeah, for most of the time, for most studies, yes. But sometimes people can also be seen in Bedford, Massachusetts. We have enough people out here at these Compass programs out here. We'll start doing stuff out here. Is transportation provided? and I want to drive in Boston. Well, yeah, transportation's either provided, where we'll get a taxi for you or a car service, or we'll pay for your gas mileage, we'll pay for parking, etc. Transportation should never be an issue. Do participants get paid to participate? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. It depends on the study. And then, who oversees this stuff? Am I going to be abused? Am I going to be poked and prodded and no one's going to care what happens to me? I can tell you that there are so many regulations and oversight organizations and very necessary and important bureaucracies to make sure that every single person participating in human research is protected. Can residents in assisted living participate in research? Yeah, it depends on the type of research and the specific study. But yes, so residents in a memory neighborhood, something like that, can participate in very important research studies. Does there need to be a family member available? Well, sometimes there needs to be, most of the time, there needs to be someone to serve as an informant, to be able to talk about the person, to provide accurate information. That could be a family member, a friend, someone who sees the person on a regular basis. Do all studies involve medication? No. We have all kinds of non-medication studies. Can I quit once I start, or am I stuck forever? No, you can quit, of course, any time. And is participation confidential? Completely. Completely. We wouldn't exist if we ever broke any confidentiality. And so I want to end with just this concept of just one. It's really shocking when I go around giving talks that people are unaware how hard it is for us to get research subjects. And that people in the audiences are shocked that it's so hard for us. People think that research centers like the BU Alzheimer's Disease Center, we're one of 29 centers in the country, funded by the U.S. National Institutes of Health. We are one of those 29 centers that do all the big groundbreaking research anywhere in the country. There's another one in Boston, at that other big hospital thing that I don't like talking about. We have two right here in Boston, 2 out of the 29 around the country, and we both struggle to get people to participate in research. And yes, if this talk could result in just one person participating in research, just one person, it would make a tremendous difference. It doesn't need to be people actually sitting here. It can be your loved ones. It can be your friends. You could pass on something that you got. If it's just one person from this one talk that we could get into one of our studies, then I have been successful. And without that, I'm afraid of failing. And so please help by spreading the word. You've got the information to contact, but most importantly, you have Dion here, who has all kinds of handouts for research studies. Sign up to just get on a mailing list. If you want to have someone call you about research, nothing is signing your life away, but please get some information to help you figure out whether you or someone in your life can participate in research. If it's someone who lives far away, the Alzheimer's Association has this thing called Trial Match at that website. That, let's say you have a mother who lives in Poughkeepsie. You can put in specific information, or you can call the number for it, and they'll tell you what research is available there. This is my staff who does the clinical research at BU. You can see Dion smiling. These are some of the most phenomenal human beings there are. I'm the luckiest guy in the world. And so it all comes down to hope, the help in diagnosis, help in evaluation, get help through the Alzheimer's Association, either through us or a place called the Boston Center for Memory. There's all kinds of places where you can get good evaluations. And remember, keep a sense of humor. So for that, I'll end here, and if you have any questions, I'd be glad to take it. This question. The question for the people who couldn't hear it is things like Aricept, Namenda, Razdyne, Exelon. You're put on it, and then 3 years later you realize you're still on it, or your loved one's still on it. what's the recommendation for how long to stay on it? It's a very hard question because if it's not causing any problems, if it's not causing any side effects, and it's not financially imposing, then why stop it? Especially because there's anecdotal reports that says, when my mom went off Aricept after 10 years, went completely downhill. I hear that all the time. But there's a placebo effect, an expectation by family members, by the patient, and by staff at a facility. Person's been okay for a long time, you stop something that they've been doing, then all of a sudden everything that you seem to pick up on is due to the no more Aricept. Well, it could be that the person was stopped because they had an infection or their GI system wasn't that good and they had to stop their medication and they started getting symptomatic because of the other thing that was going on. So it's hard to know. There's no good evidence, no scientific evidence that suggests that after a couple years it does any good. But if it doesn't do any harm, it's a hard answer to come up with. Ooh, another fantastic question. Is Alzheimer's inherited? Yes, I just happen to have slides ready to answer that question. Age is the biggest risk factor. African Americans seem to be a greater risk. Hispanics seem to be a greater risk for showing the dementia of Alzheimer's. Females are around 25 times more likely to show Alzheimer's dementia. Low education seems to be an important issue. I'm just skipping over a lot of these things. But does it run in families? Family history of dementia. If you have a family history of a first-degree relative, a parent or a sibling who has been diagnosed in some time with dementia, there's probably a 3 to 4-fold increased risk for you getting it also. But why? And so to answer the inherited stuff, you need to know that there's 2 different types of Alzheimer's disease. The very rare familial Alzheimer's and the very common sporadic Alzheimer's. The familial or younger onset Alzheimer's is probably less than 1% of all cases of Alzheimer's. And it's caused by one of 3 known genes. If you've got that type of gene, the wrong form of it, you're going to get it. But it's very rare, and so we know the families around the world who have this. One of the most commonly studied families is in the area of Medellin, Colombia, where huge percentage of that family for decades and decades now have been developing very bad Alzheimer's dementia in their 30s and 40s. But these are the wonderful folks down in Colombia. The sporadic or later onset Alzheimer's disease, the one that we're really here talking about, that affects 99% of people with Alzheimer's dementia, that does not have a specific gene that causes it. There's no one gene. There is something that we refer to as a susceptibility gene. It's called the ApoE gene. And if you have the wrong form of that gene, the E4 allele, then it increases your risk of getting it. It's kind of like the breast cancer genes, the BRCA1 and BRCA2. If you have the wrong form of the gene, it increases your susceptibility to get it. But if you don't have it, you can still get breast cancer. And if you do have it, you don't necessarily get it. So it's that kind of thing. It doesn't cause it, but it's associated with it. So yes, it's somewhat inheritable, but not strongly. Also, the question is, it seems like parents were fine, and maybe they lived till older age, and then the next generation seems to get it. Is that unusual? Not at all. Remember, 1 out of 3 people pretty much gets it, whether or not there's a family involvement. Nowadays, if someone has been told they have Alzheimer's disease, then yes, they have dementia. But what we know, that's right, they're not exactly the same. What we know is that Alzheimer's disease actually started years before, but today, in today's lingo, when someone's diagnosed by the doctor as having Alzheimer's disease, it means they have already dementia from Alzheimer's disease. So being forgetful is the biggest symptom, and what I recommend strongly is for anyone who has a real sense of being forgetful to go to the doctor and tell them that and have the doctor see what's going on. That'd be a real important thing to do. Medicare insurance companies, they cannot have access to research data, period. They just can't. Genetic information, health information, that you're even participating, they can't find out. Personal identifiable information is only, the personal identifiable information is not shared. By coded number, it's shared with like one of our studies is the HOPE study, where we put in all the data into this national database of all the other 29 centers. And no identifiable information, but all the data that are collected on the person are put into one big database. So those kinds of things. All right, well, thank you very much.
Senior Living Residences is an assisted living and Alzheimer's care organization that serves about 1,000 seniors around Massachusetts. And to make our Alzheimer's care as effective as possible and to carry out our mission of treating the symptoms of Alzheimer's in a residential setting in a very person-centered way, we've tried to tie together the leading edge research that's done at great institutions like the Medical School of Boston University and their Alzheimer's Disease Center with the day-to-day caregiving that happens in our campus communities, where caregivers are providing care, both personal care as well as social interaction type of care, to the residents in our Cornerstone at Milford Assisted Living and the Compass Alzheimer's Care neighborhood at Cornerstone, as well as the Compass at Hopkinton Alzheimer's neighborhood. So what we have done is to work with the BU Medical School and do trainings for our caregivers and to provide programming that even the Alzheimer's Association has told us is some of the leading programming for folks that have dementia and Alzheimer's in any assisted living setting that cares for people with dementia.
As an Alzheimer's disease researcher, it is so critical to spread the word. So it's something I'm passionate about. I need to let people know about this devastating disease and its impact on the individual and on the caregivers and on economy and our whole culture. And so it's something I love to do, is to get out and spread the word, whether it's to professionals or to lay audiences. That's what I really love to do. An extra benefit of it is to try to reach out and allow people to know that we need people to participate in research. It is so critical for us to get people to sign up for research. It's also helpful for them, but we need so many people. We need people who are young, old, caregivers, people with Alzheimer's disease, people with early stages of the disease, people who want to participate in clinical trials for a few years, people who just want a one-time diagnostic visit. We need people to participate. So it's a way for me to get out and let people know that we need people.